Listos.
Ready? I'm Haywood Hall. I'm the grandson of Ethel and Herman Midlo. And I'm here interviewing my mom, who's the daughter of Ethel and Herman Midlo. And well, she'll tell you who she is. I'm sure you know. And so there's some questions that I'm going to ask for this interview. And but why don't we start with, why don't you introduce yourself, and the camera's over there.
Okay, well, my name is Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, and I took the initiative in setting up the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies 25 years ago. And I'm very proud to be interviewed by my son, Dr. Haywood Hall, who is one of the leading international emergency medicine physicians and has done a great deal of work in improving emergency medical care in Mexico.
That's my mom. Okay, so I guess, I want to start with just, how you grew up and what what happened in New Orleans and the context and what it is,
Okay.
the family and all of that. And also, obviously where Grandpa came out of. And
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, it's a long story, which I will try to make short. My father was born in Sosnowiec, which is now part of Poland. It was Upper Silesia. And he came from a Jewish family, but they were culturally Jewish, but not much believers. And they were also revolutionaries against the Tsarist regime in Russia, which was then dominating the area. And there were a lot of pogroms in which the Cossacks would come through and kill off a lot of Jews. And they belonged to an organization called the Jewish Labor Bund, which defended the Jewish community with arms against the pogroms and organized labor unions. This was an extremely poor area. It was so poor that my father was born with rickets, and he could not walk until he was 4 years old, and he never could walk without a cane. He grew up with both legs dwarfed and one very badly twisted. And he was no doubt in pain most of his life, although I didn't know what pain was till I got to be a lot older. It was passed along in the family that, first of all, that his older brother was a teenager but active in the 1905 revolution against the Tsar, and the entire family supported the Jewish Labor Bund and the revolution. And when my father was a baby, they hid revolutionary literature in his diapers and crib. So he came over to the United States with some very clear-cut ideas. And one thing that was nice about the Jewish Labor Bund is that it was internationalist, so that it was not an in-looking group like the Zionists. They were against the Zionists. And their philosophy was that they were Marxists, okay? So they had study groups in which the works of Marx were translated into Yiddish, and they would read this literature. And so their identification was with the international working class. Okay, so after the 1905 revolution failed, things got very bad for them. And they were a pretty big family. Although my grandmother had 16 children born alive. Only 6 of them survived childhood, and the rest pretty much starved to death. It was so bad that my grandmother would not feed my father because she thought he was going to die anyway. And so she saved the food for the children who had a better chance to survive. And my Aunt Mina really loved him very much, and she shared her food with him in order to keep him alive. So that can give you an idea of how bad it was. They grew chickens under their table in order to get eggs, and maybe on great major holidays they might have even cooked a chicken. And my father told me that when a chicken laid an egg, they would boil it and cut it into 4 pieces, and each piece was given to the few people who were lucky enough to get eggs. So after 1907, the czars were coming after the young men, trying to induct them into the czarist army. And that was practically a death sentence, especially for Jewish men. So they left Poland in order to escape from the repression that followed the failure of the 1905 revolution. So they left in 1907. They went to Germany. They lived in a town called Offenbach, which was close to Frankfurt. And they had somewhat better life there. My father went to elementary school. He learned German, which he never forgot all his life. But then the war, World War II World War I, was about to break out. And they didn't have papers, and the German government was running around looking at papers. And so they decided that they had to leave Germany before they got caught or interned or whatever. So 2 of the sons went to New York to look at how things were there and smooth the way. And then when they came back, they said, no, we don't want to go to New York. The conditions in the garment district are so terrible there that we wouldn't be able to hardly live. So they ended up by coming to New Orleans instead. So they didn't come through Ellis Island like most people did. They came over, the entire family left. They didn't leave anybody behind. So they came over on 3 different voyages, all in about the same time. In December of 1913, they arrived in January 1914, which was just a few months before World War I broke out. So after they landed, they started looking for a cousin. They were told that they had a cousin who owned a restaurant in New Orleans, and that's why they stopped there. So they couldn't find the cousin. Then it just happened that when they landed, there was a legal lynching going on of a businessman in Atlanta. And after they'd been there for about 1.5 years, the man ended up by being held in a state prison in Georgia. And the leading jurists and legislators broke into the prison and took him out and lynched him. So after that, they moved to Chicago. I think that's probably the reason. They lost their taste for the Deep South. So then they were in Chicago for a while. In the garment district there was just as bad. My father told me that the entire family worked for a garment industry company for $5 a week. They paid one salary for everybody. And so then finally things were so bad that they returned to New Orleans. And once they got to New Orleans, they opened a tailor shop on South Rampart Street, and that was the business district for the black community. Now, there were a number of Jewish tailors, because a lot of the Jews in Eastern Europe were tailors. And this became the Jewish tailors had a certain amount of economic autonomy because they did their own work. They didn't have a payroll to meet because they had family members doing all the work, including the salesman and the sewing. My Aunt Mina was always sitting at one of these foot pedal Singer sewing machines. That's the way I always envisioned her. Okay, now I say that they had some autonomy because people have no idea how terrible the racism was in those days, and it astonishes me that people really have no idea how bad it was. And this included not just how black people were treated and brutalized and murdered and tortured and just endless, but white people had to conform to racism, or they would either be driven out, or they couldn't get a job, or they couldn't get housing, or there was tremendous pressure on white people to conform to this racism. Now, the Jewish tailors on South Rampart Street were a little bit better off than some people because they didn't depend on the white community for their income, because almost all their customers were black men who had very high-priced taste in clothes, and they were delighted to be able to get good quality clothing made for them. Now, my father was asked to take responsibility for the tailor shop, and he agreed to do that provided he could go back to school.
Was asked by who?
Huh?
Was asked by the family?
By his father.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he went to night school to get his high school education. And when he was in a debating club in high school, and one of his teachers said, "You should go to law school because you're a good debater." And so then he decided to go to law school, and he went to Loyola University Law School at night while he continued working as a tailor, and he put a sign up in his store that said, "The tailor with the college education." Now, he took on tremendous responsibility. He married my mother in 1926. My sister was born in 1927. His parents both got sick, and he took them in and took care of them, both of them. And he also took responsibility for the medical education of his older brother. And his older brother was at Johns Hopkins Medical School. I will cut the story short because he was a very interesting man too, the original Dr. Midlo. And my father I was born in 1929, and so my father started practicing law maybe a year or two before I was born. Both my grandparents died when my mother was pregnant with me. I never met them, but I'm named after both of them. Okay, so when my father started practicing law, it was about 1930, which was the depths of the Depression. And he could rarely find any clients who could pay him. But that didn't bother him at all. You know, he took people, you know, he would take clients who he felt needed help and were deserving, and never charged them anything. And my mother would get furious because she didn't want him to work for nothing, you know. But what my father did was that he took on a lot of cases that no other lawyer in the state would take, because it was too dangerous for them to take these cases. So in the whole state of Louisiana then, I guess all the way through the mid-40s, there were 3 African American lawyers in the whole state of Louisiana. And they were hesitant to take any touchy cases either, like police brutality, for example. I think my father was the only one who would take a police brutality case. He also took labor organizing cases, and that's what he did mainly, was early stage labor organizing. When the Congress of CIO, which stands for Congress of Industrial Organizations, started organizing in the South, and they had a principle that they would not segregate their locals. They were very much opposed to racism. And they were, the labor organizers were always getting beaten up and thrown in jail and tortured to run them out of town. My father was put on a retainer to get all of the organizers out of jail when they were arrested. So when I was a small child, we used to drive them across the state line to Mississippi on weekends, where they would be much safer than in Louisiana. So we used to listen to their stories. And my father indoctrinated me as I was growing up about the cases he was handling. And it was not just talk, it was show and tell. Aside from bringing his clients home to tell us their stories, he would show me documents, he would show me photographs. When I was 10 years old, he showed me photographs of the Sheriff Leander Perez's deputies shooting down women shrimp packers. They were on a picket line, and they shot them down for picketing. And I remember seeing these pictures with the women with holes in their stomach from the bullets. And we still have some of the pictures in my father's files at University of New Orleans, with some of these pictures of the women who were lying on bed with holes in their stomachs and bleeding. And, you know, this was rather moving to me, and it's something that I never forgot. So I was raised pretty much by my father, who told me all about these cases and instilled in me the idea that I should oppose repression, oppose racism, and stick my neck out, take a chance, okay? So my mother pretty much went along with these things because that's what my father believed. I don't think she had any particular beliefs herself one way or the other, but she always backed him up. Should we go change the topic at this point?
You've covered a good number of questions here already. The neighborhood that you lived in, was it the same neighborhood where you worked, where Grandpa worked, or around Rampart Street?
I lived on Rampart Street for a while, but mainly we grew up in houses uptown, so.
Okay. And so you went to school in New Orleans. What was that like? And
it couldn't have been much worse, okay? The teachers spent most of their time passing on racist comments about black people. That's what
I assume it was not an integrated school.
Oh, by no means. Are you kidding?
I know, I'm just asking.
Okay, no, certainly not. New Orleans had this wonderful school system. First of all, they had almost no money, but they distributed it in a wonderful way. They had an elementary school, public school, boys and girls went to the same classes. But in high school, they had separate high schools for girls and separate high schools for boys. And then there was the Catholic school system. And the Catholic school system was even more complicated because they had separate schools for boys and girls in elementary school and also in high school. And then they separated them by race so that you had schools for black girls and schools for white girls, then schools for black boys, and then schools for white boys. And then the same thing went on in high school. The Catholics had 4 different types of schools.
And so you went to college there? You went to the university there?
I did for 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was that like?
Well, every time I started in school, I was completely disgusted by the racist diatribes from the teachers. And I kept my mouth shut until I got to be an adolescent, when I wouldn't keep my mouth shut any longer. And so in my first year in high school, I was in public school, girls' school, and the teacher was ranting and raving about how terrible and inferior black people were, and how much her parents' slaves loved them, and how good they were to their slaves, and terrible stuff about the U.S. Army occupying New Orleans, and all this stuff. And so I finally started looking at her in disgust. So she noticed this, of course, and she started looking straight at me and saying all these things, and I continued to look at her with disgust. So she finally said, I tell those Yankees when they talk about race equality that, would you want your daughter to marry one? And this was supposed to be the final argument, and I still stared at her in disgust. And so she finally came right up to me and she says, if there's anybody in this room who would marry one, would you stand up? I stood up. That was the end of me in that school, okay? So my mother would get calls from the teachers claiming I did all kinds of things that I didn't do. There was one call she got from her that she had asked us to bring books to class. So I would be, so we could read the books at our desk and not bother her. So I brought a book called You and Heredity. which was a Book of the Month Club book. And she came down the aisle and she looked at the book and she said, "Let me have that, Gwendolyn." And she grabbed the book. She called my mother and said she caught me reading obscene literature. So my mother came and she opened the page to a diagram of the sperm cell fertilizing the egg cell. She says, "Now what would a 13-year-old girl be interested in that for?" So my mother was nice, good enough after she got a few more calls like that to decide I was in the wrong school. So then they sent me to the most elite private school in town, which was called Newman High School. Some of the greatest intellectual figures in the country came out of that school. Well, it was a little better because they did teach me something in some of the classes instead of just ranting about race. And when they did rant about race, they were much more polite and detached about it. But I still couldn't stand being in the school. I couldn't stand my fellow students. And I ended up by dropping out of high school. Then I came back and I was tutored in French for a week, and then I took a French qualifying exam, and on that basis they graduated me from high school. Then I went to Newcomb College, which was the women's division of Tulane University. And that was pretty awful too. So I decided, well, maybe the real courses are being taught at Tulane. So I signed up for courses at Tulane, and it wasn't much better. And
Did you have an interest in history at that point?
Yes, I took 2 majors in history.
Okay.
European and something American, both, yeah. The problem was that American history at that time was absolutely ridiculous. For one thing, I was interested in slavery, and the great authority on slavery was U.B. Phillips, whose basic ideology was that Africans were so lucky to be brought to the Americas so they could learn something. And that's what they taught, you know. And they also taught something called the consensus theory of history. I bet you never heard of that.
No.
That theory was that we had never had any conflict in American history. No conflict whatsoever. Everybody's always gotten along fine.
Until?
No, there was no
period. End of
until.
story.
There was no until, okay?
In other words, shut up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just couldn't go along at all with any of that. Meanwhile, I had helped organize an interracial youth movement in 1945, and I was very busy with that. And finally, we were arrested in 1949 for having a party at a private residence in the French Quarter. And that was not against the law, because segregation only applied to public places, not private places. But that didn't matter to the police, so they arrested us anyway, and they claimed we were making loud and unusual noises. So the newspapers published our names and addresses in 3 editions of all the newspapers for 3 days. And during the trial, there were taxi drivers sitting in the back of the courtroom saying, we need to take all these white women out of here and rape them. And the judge didn't bother the judge at all. So one of the police testified, well, you know how it is when you get niggers together. They talk loud and laugh loud and make a lot of noise. And so our lawyer said, moved that the charges be dropped based on racial prejudice. And the judge turned around and he says, that's not racial prejudice. Everybody knows that's true. So anyway, that was my schooling.
So, yeah. All right. So, I guess, one of the kind of topics that's of interest is how this is connected to your work ultimately. And, you've made great strides and pioneered in the area of slavery and digital humanities and all of those things. And in many ways, you're obviously one of the inspirations for the Midlo Center itself. So if you could talk a little bit about
Okay, the work. All right. Now again, I have to get back to my father because he introduced me to documents in courthouses when I was about 15. He hired me to work in his office, and he had me doing title searches. In other words, you go into the courthouse and you see who bought what from whom and if it was paid for and if to make sure there was no mortgages outstanding and that kind of thing. And so he took me to some courthouses, and I was looking around and I saw all these documents written in French. And so I was thinking, gee, that's interesting. Why are all these documents written in French and what do they mean? So I didn't know, but then after I learned French, then I was able to read those documents. And when my father was dying, and I came down to visit him, and then I would go to the courthouses and look at the documents, which by then I could read in French and Spanish. And they looked quite fascinating to me. And I seemed to have a lot of things there that nobody knew about. So finally, I decided that I would study slavery in colonial Louisiana. Now, the place that I went which really aroused my curiosity was, I knew that there had been a slave conspiracy in Point Coupé Parish in 1795. And there was a PhD thesis. Can't remember who wrote it, but we really need to look it up because his name should be mentioned. He found the testimony, and he mentioned that when they called slaves up to testify, they were asking them what was their nation. And a lot of them identified their African ethnicity. So I started, I went to see the original documents. That was back in 1984. And I found this testimony and I thought, well, maybe there might be other documents that also identify the origins of these Africans. And I started to look, and I found documents that went back to 1771. And they were just not just full of information about the African origins of the slaves, but a whole lot of other things about the slaves. And at that time, nobody had any idea that such enlightening documents could exist. Like in those days, people thought, oh, we can't know anything about the past of slaves because they were slaves, and we have no information about them. And it turned out that was the opposite of the truth. It's just that nobody had looked. There's more information about slaves than about free people because the slaves were property. And so they needed to identify the property. And it was astounding how much information there was. And so at that point, we used to use these little index cards to take down information. But this stuff was so dense and complex that I decided this just won't work. So I was teaching at Rutgers University then, and I had a colleague there who I asked about databases. I don't know why I even thought of databases, because I had no way of knowing what they were. But he did, in fact, know about databases.
What year was this?
1984.
I mean, the first Macintosh came out in 1984. There
Yeah.
was hardly anybody using computers.
That's true. It was quite early. So actually, I created the first original digital database in history.
In history.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe in other things too, I don't know. But anyway, it was quite advanced. Now, I didn't realize I was doing anything important because to me it was just a tool for my own research. And I thought that maybe some other scholars might want to look at it, or use it or something. It never occurred to me that anybody else would be interested. So I used that database for the book I published called Africans in Colonial Louisiana. The origins of Afro-Creole culture in the 18th century, something like that. That's a long subtitle. But that book got a huge amount of attention. It's not only still in print, as is everything and any other book I've published, but it's never been remaindered. You still have to pay for it. It got 9 book prizes.
That's when you were like, that was on the front page of the Sunday Times and stuff like that.
No, that was a database.
That was the database, okay.
Okay, I'm talking now about the book that came, I used the original database in. That database was only from Point Coupé Parish.
Okay.
Now, after the book got all this attention, I thought, well, maybe we can look at some other parishes and see what they have. And so I put through a grant proposal with the National Endowment for the Humanities to extend the database throughout the state. And we did it we ended up by doing it all the way through 1820. I partnered with Patrick Manning doing this. Now, when I saw all of the names, I decided this is really important. We really have to collect all of the names that we see on these documents. And a number of guys said, what do you want to do that for? We're just interested in statistics. I said, well, you may be interested only in statistics, and I'm interested in statistics too, but I'm also interested in human beings and what they were like, including what their names were and how they were related to each other. And so and they said, that'll slow you down. I said, well, it'll just have to slow me down. So I did it that way. Then I published the databases on a CD. In those days, you did that stuff on that kind of thing on compact discs. And Louisiana State University Press brought it out in 2000. Yeah, the year 2000. Well, it was reviewed by a genealogy columnist in the local newspaper. Then that summer, I finally for some reason I spoke to my press, and they says, oh, you know, by the way, everybody's on vacation, it's summertime, but the New York Times has been trying to get in touch with you. I said, what? They said, oh yeah, they've been trying to get in touch with you. I said, will you give me the name of the reporter? So they did, and I called him. And he came to my house, and he spent hours and hours with me. He wrote a front page, Sunday front page story about my databases. And it took up the entire inside of the national section of the New York Times. And after that, the genealogists started looking at it, and they went crazy over it. This was the first time they were able to trace back their slave ancestry and find out how they were related to each other and to other people, and who was the master. And you know, it was really a boon for genealogists. They're still using it like crazy. Scholars, surprisingly, weren't using it that much, and I couldn't figure it out until I realized this was very difficult for normal human beings to use. And I thought it was easy, you know. I thought, well, this is so much easier than fooling around with index cards, but they just don't think like that. And it's only recently that scholars are beginning to use it more. And that came out, what, 16 years ago.
So there was an article, I think actually front page article in the American Bar Association Journal too, that came out.
That was a cover story.
A cover story.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
American Bar Association Journal, which really goes all over the place. Yeah, this was about a man who's been my friend ever since, because even before the databases were published, he found his African ancestor on the database. And he started looking for his ancestors and found them on the database. He found out about how much they were sold for and who paid for them. And so he started saying, well, I want to be reimbursed for what they sold my great-grandmother for. And that didn't go over big. Right? But they put him on the on the cover of the American Bar Association Review. And there was an inside story all about my databases, and they said, this work completely overturns the main objection to reparations for slavery, because we thought that we could never know who if there was any victims and perpetrators. But with this database, yes, we do know. Yes, we can trace who did what to whom. So that was the legal side of it.
So you even got to be on People magazine and...
Oh yes, that's true. I'm glad you're remembering all of this, right? Yeah, there was a story in People magazine, of all places.
Right. And of
Two-page
course,
story.
And then of course you got knighted by the French government. That's always a...
Yeah, well, that was,
That's
actually, that happened before the database was published.
Well, good. So,
Oh, and then my most recent book was called Slavery and African Ethnicities in the Americas, Restoring the Links. And so it was studying Africa, various regions of Africa, and various parts of the Americas, and the links between these regions. And that book has just been bought by a Brazilian publishing company to translate it into Portuguese and sell it in Brazil. And I must say I was 75 when I completed that book, and I had to learn to read Portuguese in order to do the research. It wasn't that different, you know, it's pretty close to Spanish, but not that close.
So when you were looking up all this material, you were also taking digital pictures of documents and all of that. And what kind of resistance or difficulty did you have going into these parish courthouses and taking pictures of, I mean, it seems like that's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
Okay, well, in the courthouses, most of the clerks of court had no idea what they had. And so we would come, I had some research assistants by then. So we would go into a courthouse and ask, say we wanted, and they'd want to know what we want to look at. And we'd tell them we want to see the 18th century documents about slavery. They said, first, most of them said, you can't read that, that's in French. I said, but we can read French. Oh, well, one of the places I went, the first courthouse I went to said, oh, we didn't have slaves. And of course, he really believed it, you know. He went to get a census to prove to me that they didn't have slaves, and he brought it back. It was a census of 1745. And we looked at it together, and there were more slaves than non-slaves in the parish. So actually it became a money-making thing for many courthouses, that because they charged so much per page when they did Xerox copies of pages. So mostly, you know, I did have research assistants copying complicated documents, but mainly if it was just lists of slaves, then we worked in the courthouses. We came in with some of the earliest portable computers, laptops. That was way back when, too. And I supervised them, showed them how to do it, made sure they were doing it right, you know, and so then I'd let them go work on their own. But most of the work we did was directly working in the courthouses.
And you also wound up going to, like, to Cuba and Spain and other places. You did a
Oh
lot of
yes, I
travel.
became a lecturer. I'd never lectured before. And the first time I lectured was in Morocco, where the students spoke Arabic, but they had a passive knowledge of, was it French or Spanish? I guess it was Spanish. And so the professor who invited me to come there went over my lecture notes. He says, oh, that's much too dense. He says, I will tell them what you want to say to them, and then that you can answer their questions. And so, how did we do it? I think they asked questions in Arabic, and the professor translated them into Spanish, and then I answered in Spanish, which they understood. Then I went to West Africa. I lectured in Senegal. Then I lectured in Burkina Faso. Ouagadougou.
Got
Right.
a postcard from Ouagadougou.
I'd never heard of it till I went there. But
So-
I was very well received. in West Africa. They liked what I was saying. And I urged the professors, history professors in West Africa to try to get computers from the American Cultural Center. And they did. I don't think they remembered that I had urged them to do that, but I had brought my Zenith portable computer with me. And that thing was weighed about 20 pounds. It was like this.
Sewing machine.
I could hardly lift it. But that was a portable computer of those days.
I remember that. So, tell us a little bit about the Whitney Plantation Museum and a little bit of that history. And I mean, you're kind of a prominent part of that.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, that was interesting. I was living in New Orleans because I went back after I retired from Rutgers and moved back there. And I got a telephone call from somebody I didn't know. And he says, "I'm looking for Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. Do you know where she is?" I said, "Well, you were speaking to her." He says, "No, I can't believe it. I've been looking for you all over the world. And then somebody told me you were living in New Orleans, and I didn't believe it. But you really are there." That was John Cummings, who was the founder of the Whitney Slave Museum Plantation. And he told me that my book had inspired him to buy the place and create the museum. And I introduced him to my protege from Senegal, and he hired him, and his name is Ibrahim Asek, and he works as research director at the plantation now. And he took you around the plantation.
Right, I was just there a few months ago. Actually, about 2 months ago.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't seen it since it's been completed because I have not been mobile enough to get there. But it's been really, it's gotten tremendous press and continues to do so.
So, just going back a little bit to the database and reparations and all of those things. So, Georgetown, which is one of the most expensive universities in the United States, there's been an acknowledgement from them of their role in slavery, and they have a plan now to reimburse or to provide scholarships for students who are in your database, or do you know
No.
any details?
These are descendants of slaves who were sold by the Jesuits who ran that university. Maybe they still run it, I don't know. But they were sold in the 19th century in order to keep the university afloat because it was running out of money. So I think there was something like 280 slaves who they sold south, I think to New Orleans. And a lot of their ancestors are still in the state. And so Georgetown agreed to set up the scholarship fund for their descendants. I think that's what you're talking about,
Yes.
right?
Uh-huh.
But I don't think that had anything to do with my database because it was later. I think it was in the 1840s or something like that. However, we've been trying to get the database updated through the entire period of slavery. That would bring it to, well, in Louisiana it would probably be the early 1860s. But it's been very complicated to get that done because now everything is on the web. That reminds me, I put the database on the website in 2001, which was the first historical database that ever went onto a website. it took about a decade before another one went up.
So anybody can access this information, basically.
Yeah, it's free. And that too was reviewed widely, and
So I think we've covered a lot, actually.
we
Great
haven't covered the origins of the Midlo Center.
Well, I was going
Yeah.
to ask you about that and another question. Let's go do that. We're into the middle center.
Okay. Now, my father died, I think it was 1976 or 7, I'm not sure which. And my mother, when she started getting older and preparing for her own death and her estate and stuff, she told me, look, your father did so much for the community, and nobody ever acknowledged what he did. And nobody ever talks about him, and his name will be forgotten. And I want to do something to preserve his name in the community. And I have money set aside to do that. So and she says, you are the only one I can depend upon to do this. So I was still teaching at Rutgers, but when I was off for a while and I came back, and I started asking around about how to do this. And Joseph Logsdon was still alive then and at UNO. And he suggested that we set up an endowed chair in his name at UNO. Now, those were the good old days when the state had some money. And so they had this provision that if anyone puts up $600,000 towards an endowed chair, then the state would put $400,000 towards its excellency fund, which came out of oil revenues. And so we did arrange, and we did that. And then we went a bit further, and my mother endowed a lecture series. I don't know, the lecture series might have come first, I forget how that worked. But anyway, there was also a lecture series endowed under her will. And the Midlo Center was established under her will as well. And so before anything else was done with her estate, the money went to the University of New Orleans to take care of these things. So I played the major role in family diplomacy. My nephew, Larry Lehman, was very much in favor of our doing this too. And so he also played a major role.
One of the areas that the Midlo Center is working on seems to be a focus is on mass incarceration.
Yes, this is fairly new, and that's very good. They're doing really great work on that. But it's not up to me to talk about that because they know more about it than I do.
Well, so what would you see as the relationship between mass incarceration and, is this like, is this one of the vestiges of slavery or?
No, this is not devoted to, the Midlo Center is not devoted to slavery.
Okay.
It's New Orleans Center for New Orleans, Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies. So that's multidisciplinary and it's not restricted to any time period. So that it does encompass mass incarceration. They do a lot of work with the Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana too.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Neville brothers and their interest in your work? Because I always found that fascinating, the musical side.
Oh, yes, that was another side of it. It was taken up by the musicians of the book. My book was taken up by the musicians of New Orleans, and it had a purple cover, and they referred to it as the Purple Book. And it turned out that one of the Neville brothers' wives was her mother. When she was born with the assistance of my medical doctor, my uncle. So we got together and figured that out because she recognized my name and she asked me if I was related to him.
There's also there's a story related to Wynton Marsalis and some of his work. Are you familiar with that?
No.
That's very interesting. Well, he won a Grammy for a album called Blood in the Fields, and I was reading that that some of that might have been in some way inspired by your work. Like you said, it was
By the content of
yeah.
it, right? Yeah.
So you didn't hear anything. You'd never heard anything about that.
It sounds familiar. That's very recent, though, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else?
well, what are the questions?
We went through
We went through all the
questions.
questions.
Yeah. So
That was pretty good.
yeah, I think so. I think we covered a lot.
Is there anything that you think I should say? A lot. This doesn't have to all go into this broadcast because they
Right.
very much want us to say whatever we can say,
Mm-hmm.
so they can keep it as part of the record at the center.
Yeah. Well, I found it interesting, the part of where whites were kind of forced to conform to this racist standard of the time.
Yes, they were whites who did not go along with racism were considered more dangerous than African Americans. And there were a number of devoted anti-racist whites throughout the South. Some of them did lose their lives, especially during the 1930s, when the unions started organizing their interracial unions. They really converted a lot of white workers to become anti-racist. Surprisingly large numbers of them.
So, from rolling forward the family history a little bit, I mean, obviously you married Dad, my father, who's
Yes,
black, and
yeah.
so I guess you probably got the last word on that teacher that you were talking about in school.
Yeah.
But so, and that was in the mid-50s and
50s.
1950s?
Oh, when we married?
Yeah.
Yes, that was mid-1950s, yes.
So, tell me about how you met Dad and how this, what kinds of issues might have been there with the family in Louisiana. Because it was obviously a complicated situation with race and with generation and with politics. You probably couldn't have pushed more red buttons without.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the reaction. Okay, I met your dad in Paris in 1950 at a May Day parade. And I looked him up when I got back to New York in 1953, and I started working with him. I always admired his work, which I had read when I was a pretty young kid. And he was really distressed because of the political stuff that was going on. And I devoted about 10 years to helping him with his work. And during that time, we did some very good things politically, which I don't want to go into here. That's a whole nother topic. But my family's reaction, let me call it mixed as at best, right? My father, he had his own views about it. He was reasonably appreciative of your father. My mother was terrible. And she was so concerned about what people would think, which really stunned me, because she was always the kind of person who never cared what people thought. You know? But about this, it was another matter. And they had a 50th wedding. Okay. My father had a birthday party, which my sister gave for him. My sister was always very good about this, you know, regardless of anything. No, she was very supportive. And she invited us all to the birthday party. Did you go? Did you go to my father's birthday party? No, Haywood was not very happy about visiting there at all. But my daughter went. And then after that, they had a 50th wedding anniversary. And my mother wanted me to come, but she didn't want me to bring my children. Well, Haywood wouldn't have gone anyway, but my daughter would have gone. And she would not, you know, I had no intention of agreeing to go to their party without my children. So my father was saying, you know, he would say to me, you know, I don't know what's wrong with your mother. She's so worried about what her garden club friends would think. He says, in a few years, she won't care at all about what they think. I have no idea why she's behaving this way. But try to appease her, he says. Now you just be a good girl and come by yourself. I said, no, I'm not a good girl. And you know, there was a big conflict there. When I brought my daughter to visit, my mother started putting down my husband in front of my daughter, and I slapped her. And I just recently, my daughter told me that what a big difference it made to her that I did that. Did you know that?
No. So this event that's at the Midlo Center is going to be...
It's celebrating 25 years since it was established.
Time flies. And it's going to be, what, December 15th?
I don't remember. How do I know?
Okay. There anything else you want to say?
You know, I have a whole memoir that's very close to being finished that goes into all this stuff.